So today we're going to talk about another kind of war that was happening at the same time as World War I, and this war should sound familiar to you today. I had a little bird, and his name was Enza. I opened the window, and in flew Enza. So influenza, if you say it fast, becomes influenza. It was a catchy little rhyme, and boys and girls skipped rope to it. It was also an epidemic too, and it was worse than that. It was a pandemic, which means a disease that spread across many nations. In fact, this one went around the globe, and it was extremely deadly. Diseases don't fly in the window, but the influenza of 1918 almost seemed like it did. It lasted about 9 months, and worldwide it killed 20 million people. Some people say 30 million people. That was more than the total of deaths during the 4 years of the Great War. Mysteriously, it struck about the same time in India and in Russia and in China, and no major nation escaped it. In the United States, there were more than 500,000 victims, which is kind of interesting because just about 1 week ago, the United States passed 500,000 victims again. Now we're at 503 million, I believe, victims of the pandemic. In the United States, there were more than 500,000 victims. On one terrible day in Philadelphia, almost 1,000 people died. Neither doctors, nor hospitals, nor cemeteries could handle the awful burdens put upon them. In those days before the discovery of modern medicines, there was little that doctors could do. In New York and Chicago, laws were passed making it illegal to sneeze or cough in public without the use of a handkerchief. Police dutifully hauled sneezers and coughers to court, where they were given fines. The police had time to worry about the influenza because robbers and murderers were sick too. In October of 1918, Chicago's crime rate dropped by almost half. The epidemic spread mostly and most rapidly in cities where people were crowded together, but many in the countryside died too. A prominent senator lost his son and daughter. Soldiers fighting heroically against enemies they could see fell to invisible germs they couldn't. In America, the flu took 10 times as many lives as the war. The last week of October in 1918, 2,700 American soldiers died fighting in Europe, and that same week, 21,000 Americans died at home of the flu. It was called the Spanish influenza because people thought it had started in Spain, but it hadn't. It may have begun actually in the United States from a disease of hogs, sometimes called the swine flu after the hogs. Some say it was the worst pandemic in history. It wasn't that it killed the most people, it was that it killed them so rapidly. Someone figured mathematically that if it had continued spreading for another year at the rate that it was going at its peak, the world's population would have been wiped out. By Armistice Day, November 11th, the peak had passed, and the disease soon departed about as mysteriously as it had arrived. It left the country exhausted. Wasn't a war trouble enough? Everyone had worked hard supporting the war effort. Americans had done astonishing things in factories and on farms. They'd fed Europe with an amazing harvest of grain. They'd armed the Allies. Citizens had given up luxuries and some even necessities to help others. The flu pandemic was the final straw. Someone needed to find something to cheer people up. Just wanted you to see that the response in the United States to this 1918 flu pandemic was very similar to the response you see today with schools and churches and theaters, forms of entertainment. We're all closing, curfews at night, notices that every place that people would gather would be closed. And this is from 1919. Sports seasons, even then, were important to people. Sports were postponed. There were questions about how the military was responding and how the disease was spreading amongst the military. Soon a new word was being used called normalcy, and that's what people wanted. And it's interesting because today I think people are craving that too, right? Craving a return to just kind of normal life. They wanted to go back to the good old days before the war, but time won't march backward. The boys and girls who were skipping rope in 1918 had no idea what was ahead of them. They would have believed it. They wouldn't have believed it if you had told them. Normalcy? No way. They were going to live in a world of radio and TV and computers and jets and rockets in 1918. That was the stuff of science fiction. Their world was slow-paced and mostly powered by horses and mules. Their older brothers and soldiers who came home from Europe in 1919 had exciting things to tell them. They'd been to Paris and seen fancy nightclubs and stunning buildings and splendid boulevards. Some bragged about their heroism in battle, which was understandable. You had to be tough or lucky to be a survivor. A few came home without arms or legs, and some didn't want to talk about the war at all, and they too were looking for normalcy. The returning soldiers were surprised to find America had changed in the year they'd been gone. They noticed many things right away. First of all, 675,000 Americans would be dead. But they also noticed that one of them had to do with beer and liquor. During the war, it was considered unpatriotic to drink alcohol. Beer was made from grain. Grain was needed to feed soldiers. Plus, a lot of the early breweries were associated with German Americans, and it became kind of anti-American to support them. So now that the war was over, people wanted to put an end to all liquor drinking. It would make the world a much better place, they said. So there was this conversation about wet or dry in the United States. You can see here, even Seattle is having that conversation because wet meant that you supported people still being able to consume alcohol, and dry meant that you thought that they should make it illegal. The other change that gave soldiers maybe a chuckle was women demanding rights to vote. They wanted to be full citizens. And soon they'd probably want to wear pants too or something. I just thought you'd like to see the symptoms of the Spanish influenza, which, by the way, is a misnomer because, no nation wants to claim responsibility for a disease that affects so many people. And so even though this started in the United States, we continued to call it the Spanish influenza for a long time. But I thought you might want to see that the symptoms are similar to the coronavirus symptoms. And maybe remember that there has been a big deal made of the fact that we want to make sure people know the coronavirus may have started in China and not have, distance ourselves from responsibility for a disease, even though I don't know that people can control a disease when it starts. Last time when I created this presentation the first time, it was just right away after the school had shut down. And so this chart over here is from last year this time. So in March of last year, this is where we were with 1,800 deaths, 73,000 cases. And this morning, I pulled this off the CDC website, 28 million cases, 515,000 deaths in the United States, to say nothing about global numbers. So there we go. Flu pandemic happened then, just like it happened now, and thank you for your time.